Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Last week, you guys, we touched down on V-Wars Season 1, Episode 9, but mainly we talked about population history and structure and potential weaponization of vampire abilities as it relates to this specific show. So this week, we're also going to be talking about Episode 9 of Season 1 again, but instead of what we already touched on, we're going to start talking about where we find these characters in this penultimate episode. This portion of the show is where we start getting really socio-political. We've already introduced Senator Giroux, and now we are going to be leaning more political than just scientific, as the first portion of the show was. So today, we are going to break this down and talk about the power dynamics between the different groups and the concept of how two people in a room together can get more done than having hundreds or even a full committee. And that's where we're going to start, because that's the whole point, or at least the primary one, of this episode. Senator Giroux, as we mentioned in the previous episode on V-Wars, has tried to get a hold of Michael Fane, but Michael is not interested in speaking with a politician, and Luther has outright told her that. He's like, look, Michael did not like politicians before he turned into a vampire. He is definitely not going to be interested in speaking with you right now. So let me talk to him. And she's not super keen on this at all, but Ava has gone behind Michael's back and rallied Blood Nation, and a lot of the vampires are beginning to riot. I don't know exactly how far across the US this is supposed to have spread at this point. We do kind of see that it's highly infectious, at least as far as we can tell from this timeline. Although the timeline is a bit nebulous at times, I'm also not exactly sure how big this area of Seneca is supposed to be. But we see that Michael and the others, on their way to Senator Giroux's place, which I believe was in Pennsylvania or Rhode Island or something, was actually still problematic. Like, they had a showdown about vampires and stuff in the diner on the way, and there's been a lot of problems. So it's spreading at least regionally, but I don't know if it's gone further than, like, the eastern seaboard or even just the eastern area of the United States. But regardless, here we are, and we are seeing that this spreads rather rapidly. We've seen Mike and Danica go out and try to purposely spread the infection to the president's daughter, knowing that she would be susceptible to it. So if it wasn't already in the DC area, it is there now. And we also know that the little girl, Senator Giroux's daughter, Amelie, had a teacher at her school who had also become infected. So she probably goes to one of those rich kid schools in like the Maryland, DC area. And she's not had a great time so far. She doesn't seem super upset by it, but we do know from these circumstances of these different characters traveling and being in different schools and stuff, that it has at least spread that far. Even if we don't know how big Seneca's supposed to be, since most of the story, at least from our character's perspective, has been taking place there. Now, they are, patient 0 and the other person who found and identified the virus, so it makes sense that we're following it from their perspective, and maybe it hasn't spread throughout the entire US yet. But I think that as we've seen with COVID-19, that these types of illnesses or infectious diseases, we'll call them, that are spread via respiratory droplets can be spread really quickly, especially given the era we live in that allows for such ease of transportation across not just our country or our continent, but the entire globe. We do know that in the case of this show, it has at least made national news, especially with Revelleaks. So Kaylee Vo has been out there letting everyone know what she believes they have the right to know, that there are vampires out there and that there's more going on than the government has been telling everyone. We also know that it's big enough that DNS has sent out federal agents to lock people up in these internment camps as well, which Luther and Senator Giroux are now blowing wide open. So even if the virus itself or the prion disease itself has not spread entirely throughout the US or across the globe, it's at least spread far enough in knowledge, like in the media, in awareness, that they need to do something about it now. And that's where we find ourselves here, and with Ava having been rallying all of Blood Nation against Michael's wishes, and behind his back, they've begun to riot. And now that everyone has the truth out, Senator Giroux also is becoming increasingly desperate to get a truce with them. She seems to genuinely want one too. Yes, it would be wonderful for her political career to be able to achieve such a huge objective that would be incredibly meaningful and save lives, and also appear to be empathetic or sympathetic to the issues they're facing, but she also genuinely seems to care. She seems to take more of an approach like Luther does, even though she's a politician, in really thinking that these people can be helped. She is a politician who is dedicated to finding this middle ground at the very least, and she knows that it's not okay for people to be kept in these cages, regardless of the reasoning or whatever is happening in the world around them. So I like Senator Giroux. She seems to still be genuinely kind and empathetic and sympathetic beyond just political posturing. And I like that about her. Maybe we'll see later on that this is not all that it appears to be, but I, for one, like her. I'd vote for Senator Giroux, depending on her other politics, but based on the politics I've seen from her, I'd be down. She seems like, she really cares about the people, and we could extend what she is saying and doing about the vampire issue to perhaps other issues that we see in the world around us today. So, given that, if that follows through, then I'd vote for her. But I need to learn more about her platform first, and her voting record. So that's something else that's really important as we go into voting season. It's not enough to just listen to what they say they're going to do. It's also important to Google their voting records and talk about what they've actually done. So they can say that they have proposed a bill or have written them, but did they vote against their own bill? Did they put what's called a poison pill amendment in there as well to make sure that it wouldn't pass, but they would still get the credit for creating it? It's important to look at those things and see if your representatives really walk the walk and talk the talk, like Senator Giroux genuinely seems to. And you can do that by looking at different websites. You can go to Ballotpedia and check that out. Or my personal favorite is the Countable app, which I have on my phone. So with the Countable app, you can put in your specific area, so you have your specific representatives for the House and the Senate. And you can see what they're voting on. And it will explain to you why people might vote for that and why people might oppose it. And you can come to your own conclusions, and you can also message your representatives from within the app. It's super cool. I'm not getting paid to say this, but I just am a really big fan of sociopolitical engagement and also of this particular civics app. So check it out if you're interested in it, countable.com. Regardless of which side of the line you are on, everyone is entitled to their informed opinion. And I think that in my personal experience, you can get a lot of information from Countable. That's COUNTABLE. It will tell you how your representatives have voted on things, and you can message them about how and why you would like them to vote for certain things. Remember, they're not your leaders. They're your representatives. They're supposed to be representing you. So your voice matters, and they should be hearing you out. There are a host of other features on that app, but those are pretty much the most important ones in my personal experience, and I will let you go and download the Countable app, which is free. At least it was when I downloaded it, if you are interested in that. I always encourage informed opinions. But we're seeing that with Sasha Giroux. We're also seeing some other types of politics, like with the leader of the committee. It looks similar to like the Senate Judiciary Committee, as we discussed in our previous episode, in which the guy who is the majority leader is saying that he doesn't think that anything weird is going on, but it's very clear that he is in cahoots with Calyx Niklos. This man is the political arm of the shenanigans that Niklos is performing on the scientific side of it. Both sides are still playing political games, though. Senator Giroux, as good as she seems to be, is still a politician at heart. And while Niklos and these other Senate members are playing these nefarious games and making sure that they have access to the the DNS in this world to lock people up and just sweep them off the streets into unmarked vehicles, much like has been happening in Portland in the US recently, we also see Senator Giroux on the other side being clandestine about her movements. She can't get an audience with Michael Fain, and that upsets her, but Luther tells her, hey, I could go ahead and talk to him for you. And she's like, no, that's not happening. You do not have the authority to do that. You don't have the training to do that. You're not a politician or a negotiator. You're a scientist. And Luther's like, yeah, but that's my brother, and he doesn't trust politicians, but he might trust me. And I think I'm our best bet to get an audience with him. Like, I'll talk to you and I will go through jumping all the hoops for you and making sure that I'm running the different possibilities for this negotiation by you, but at the end of the day, I think that the only person he's likely to talk to about this is going to be me, and this is the best that you're going to get. So she decides to let him, but she also is making sure that in this situation, if things blow up in their faces, she's not going to get any of the heat for it. There's not going to be any splashback on her. No one's going to know that she had anything to do with it in any capacity at all. It honestly probably is her best bet, though. And I appreciate that she gets to be kind of a grayish character. She seems to have a good heart, but she's also a politician. Often we see this reflected the other way around, and I really enjoy seeing a woman in this gray area. It's fun, it's nuanced, and I think that the lady who plays Senator Giroux does a really great job in bringing this type of character to life. We're gonna go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're gonna pick up on how this actually works out when they meet in the cabin. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the different sides we have. We have Niklos as a scientist with his own senator, and then we also have Luther with his senator. So we have some scientist-politician alliances, and then we also have a media and vampire alliance with Kaylee Vo and Michael Fain. It really seems the only person out of the Blood Nation who likes Kaylee is Mike. Ava does not care for her, especially because Kaylee cares more about information and knowledge than being empathetic about the guy who went with Ava to get the video footage, having been slain by DNS. You would think that maybe Kaylee might be more empathetic about that, given that Jurgen was recently killed by the same people. But no, Kaylee is on a mission, and she is right back to being Kaylee. She's truly only divulged her reasoning for wanting to take down DNS and Niklos to Michael, and I think Danica might have also been there at the time. But she's just like, we want to take down the same people. They killed the man I loved. And that's it. That's as far as Kaylee sees fit to explain herself. And you know what? I'm here for it. Kaylee is not a super emotionally available person, I guess we could say. It's not even that she's not emotionally available. It's just she's private about that. She's private about weird personal things. So for Kaylee, she very much thinks that vampires being out there is a thing that people need to know, especially because it's caused by something that can be spread via your respiratory system. And folks don't have a way of knowing whether or not they're even at risk for it. I didn't even know my own blood type until 2 weeks ago when I gave blood at a local bloodmobile. It was the first time that I have been of the correct weight to be allowed to give blood. before I did not weigh enough because I'm so short, and so they would not allow it. But this time, I was actually able to. And when I signed up to give blood, they were like, "What's your blood type?" And I'm like, "I have no idea." So now I know that I'm blood type O positive. So O is my ABO blood group, and positive is my RH factor. So, I didn't know that, and I am 31. I had no idea up until a little bit ago because I had no reason to know. And very similarly, no one in this show really has a reason to know whether or not they have that NH47 gene. It's kind of similar to how people get tested for the BRCA gene for breast cancer, or people get tested for genes associated with Huntington's disease and other diseases of that nature. But unless you personally know definitively that someone in your family has died from that or has suffered a serious illness that's related to those genes, then you probably haven't been tested for it. It's sort of a need-to-know basis, and if you don't feel that you need to know, then why would you pay for it and seek that out? Also, even if you are aware of something like that happening in your family, you might not have the money to do it. Let's face it, we have a socioeconomic problem in the United States, and that is very much putting it lightly. And I'm specifically just talking about when it comes to healthcare. So, we have that problem across the board in many different realms. But it's becoming increasingly apparent in this era of COVID-19 that we have a huge healthcare disparity. There are issues of racism that are rising to the top and becoming super apparent for folks who were perhaps unaware of it before. And we also have ginormous socioeconomic issues plaguing that same system. So some folks may even have insurance, but their deductible is so high that they still can't afford that test. Or perhaps their insurance doesn't cover the test, or they may not be able to afford insurance at all. I also know some folks who, because of COVID-19, have been stuck overseas for months. They were on vacation or home visiting family and such, and were not able to return because of COVID-19 concerns and all of the airlines and the different countries and states and cities making all of these new rules that are not necessarily globally applied. So some people could get back to their home countries and others couldn't. And in those cases, how long does your travel insurance last? Or even if you're just in another state and you're required to quarantine for 2 weeks before you come back and things like that, or when you come back. Certain types of insurance only work within your state or within a specific healthcare system. I've learned a lot about insurance recently, and most of it is just really upsetting. Also, we should include the fact that my knowledge in that realm is nowhere near even approaching comprehensive. That's not my personal realm of expertise. But I like to learn a lot of new things, and I've been trying to learn more about that recently. And again, it's just mostly upsetting all around the board, how these different insurances work, and how people get trapped with certain insurances that are available to them versus those that aren't, for a plethora of reasons. And we don't really get that far into it in V-Wars, because Luther is, again, some form of doctor, and he is able to do these genetic tests, and he knows enough about epidemiology in order to go, hey, I think we should be quarantined for longer. And when Des gets sick, Luther sends him over to his friend, who is a dentist. Now, that was definitely a ruse just to get Des out of there, and saying that he had a fever and stuff because of a messed up tooth. But at the end of the day, Luther really could have just gone over to his bro and been like, hey, can you help me out with this? Lots of my friends who have money and they live in nice neighborhoods end up just reaching out to the local neighbor who is a doctor and whose kids are also friends with theirs if their kid falls over and just needs some stitches or needs their arm set. And it's kind of a form of classism in a way, and socioeconomic status that we don't think about. It's not a big deal for Des to get sick in any capacity because Luther is able to handle that, or he knows someone whom is capable of handling it. Like, Luther didn't even need to arrange for another transport to go and check on the Arctic Research Station to begin with. He just called his buddy Mike, who just happens to own his own helicopter and have all the licenses and everything that he needs to do this, on a moment's notice. It's that classism in networking, and how because Luther is privileged in that he is rich and he also has a form of, I don't want to quite say intellectual privilege, but Luther is in a class of people who tend to have more money because going to school to do these things that Luther's doing, to get your doctorate and stuff, often cost a lot of money. So he is going with all these people, or he knows these people who also have money and have access to these things via this network. And so for him, it's not that big of a deal. But we're seeing people around us in the United States today dying from doing things like trying to ration their insulin. And I would imagine that a lot of that would be going on in V-Wars as well. I know a lot of people right now are also afraid to go in and go to the doctor for strep throat and things like that, even though you need antibiotics in order to get rid of that infection because it's bacterial in nature and not viral, specifically because they're afraid of contracting COVID. So if this prion disease and V-Wars is also transmitted via respiratory droplets, it stands to reason that folks would also be concerned about getting this prion disease by going to the doctor or by seeing their neighbors. But since this makes people stronger as a vampire instead of weaker like COVID-19 does, you also probably wouldn't want to wear a mask so that people couldn't tell that you are in fact a human and not a blood just by looking at you. There are a ton of sociocultural implications in this show, and I think a lot of them are unspoken. Not necessarily unseen in the show, but unspoken. Similar to how Stargate does that, with telling stories using the beats within the silences. So telling us things based on how much certain characters do things with other characters, but not this one character. Or telling it with music, or these different gaps or changes in behavior. V-Wars is kind of like that for me too. So we don't necessarily see it explicitly told or expositionally told, but it is still there. We also really see that Senator Giroux understands how a lot of political agreements truly happen. You see this in TV shows like Poldark, which I know is not sci-fi, but I watch a myriad of different shows. Poldark is a period piece, though. It is historical fiction, so it's still speculative fiction in that overall realm. Although historical fiction for me is more reaching in speculative fiction than the types that I'm more comfortable with, like sci-fi and fantasy and horror, things like that. but you get where I'm coming from. There's a certain point in the show where two characters are trying to make political arrangements via parliament with all of these members of parliament, and even though the men are politicians, they're not able to get it done. But two of the women, who are their wives, trick the politicians who hate each other into being in the same place at the same time, without the husbands even knowing about it or being there, and the wives make them sit down to tea and use culture kind of against them, and also just get everything ironed out while they're sitting there, because it's just a couple of people in a room. It's just the four of them in a room. Only two of them are politicians, and they get far more done than they could get the entirety of Parliament to convince them to agree on. And everything comes down to where these two gentlemen stand. No one else could convince them. Everyone has tried. But because of the nature of the interaction and the cultural mores concerning how people act in polite society and interact in mixed company, they are obligated to follow these certain customs until these women kind of bring it around and convince them, oh, hey, actually, we can agree on this without either of us really seeming like we're backing down politically, and also not seeming like either one of us is weak, because we're both finding a compromise in which we both get something out of this. So that happens in Captain America Civil War too. T'Challa tells Black Widow the same thing, that just getting a couple of people in a room can accomplish more than having 100 in the same room. And he knows that because he is also a political leader. He's a leader of his people. He's not like Black Widow, who is, you know, someone who's a spy, who just goes out there and does the things that are required of her and, you know, kills people and everything, and then just walks away. She goes in when those things can't be accomplished, whereas T'Challa has this greater problem, really, and this greater challenge of trying to convince people to agree or get people to understand why a certain thing needs to happen. Black Widow can just come in and stab everybody in the neck and call it a day. And it's like, okay, you're not left to disagree with me or whoever I'm working for, so you're no longer a problem. It's a lot harder to get people to agree. And we see Senator Giroux understanding that with Luther and Mike. We see that in Captain America Civil War. And we also see that in the TV show Poldark. It's all about bureaucracy and also about hubris. It's about the arrogance and pride of mankind in general. But Giroux trusts Luther to do this. And she's just like, you better stay in contact with me. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how it actually works out for them. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about sociopolitics and the healthcare system in the United States, both in real life and as it relates to bureaucracy and politics in V-Wars. Now we're going to talk about how once Sasha Giroux appoints Luther to have this conversation with Michael, we try to get peace between the two groups, humans and Blood Nation, and how that works out. So they both show up to the cabin that they're meeting at, and it's some type of cabin with historical significance. This is not the first cabin that they met at in which, Niklos kind of tried to have both of them killed. Mostly Michael, but I have a feeling that at a certain point, Niklos would have just killed Luther anyway as well. I mean, technically, Niklos also tried to have Luther killed later on, but he really only needed him to get to Michael, primarily. Luther, sure, was helpful, but ultimately wasn't it Teresa who discovered the NH47 gene and not Luther anyway? Yeah, that's right. So, anyone else who is an expert in that field would have been able to find that as well, I think. I've discussed my opinion on that in the past, but ultimately, if even my personal opinion aside, the fact of the matter is that Teresa found the gene and not Luther. So he was expendable even before Niklos ended up sending someone after him. Of course, they're not going to go back to that location, so they are at some location, some other cabin that has been arranged by Senator Giroux. It is some place that has been the site of other treaties and such in the past, and they've each taken one person with them. As we discussed in our previous episode, Michael has decided to take Kaylee with him because she's more functional as a hostage than either Ava or Danica are. Because Ava and Danica are both vampires. They are a blood and a vertilac, specifically. Whereas Kaylee is still a human, so the humans might care more about Kaylee than they would about the Bloods. However, that doesn't really seem to bother Kaylee. She seems more smug about it than anything, which I think is hilarious. I laugh every time I think about that. She's just so glad to have been picked to go on this adventure. She's not afraid of Michael Fane, really. I mean, she's already been fed upon by Ava and that other guy, and yet she still just stands there facing them like she's not afraid at all. She's literally already been tortured by them. And she's not fazed, at least not externally. We already know Kaylee keeps everything on the inside, for the most part. She does feel, she just feels quietly in the external manner. So Kaylee's jazzed and she goes with Michael, and Luther shows up with Jimmy. And I really like Jimmy as a character. Jimmy is also nuanced, and you see him fighting through, his orders and what he has to do to fit in with his undercover op versus what is actually good and right. How he lets Danica go, because at the end of the day, to him, she is still a person and not just what has happened to her. She is being oppressed as well by a group of people who don't understand her. And as Jimmy is a Native American character, he is aware of that to a very strong degree. And he tells them that in this episode too, in which he says treaties don't mean shit. And Jimmy knows what he's talking about. He is talking about from his own personal cultural experience. And I like that Jimmy has something to say about that. He mostly came as Luther's bodyguard, but Jimmy has strong convictions, and he's also a good man, and he's not afraid to speak his mind. And so he is very much who he is completely. And that's one of the things that I like about V-Wars, period, is that each of these characters, especially the 4 who show up to do the treaty negotiations, are unapologetically themselves. Kaylee is unabashed and unafraid. She has stared down Niklos while he was threatening her and still gone and done what she felt was right. The strength of their convictions is one thing that really unites all these characters. That's in their Venn diagrams. So Kaylee is strong in her convictions, and then they killed the man she loved, and she just became stronger in it. They screwed up there. They gave her nothing left to lose. It would have been a lot smarter to just kill her directly. But unfortunately for them, that's not what they chose. So now Kaylee has doubled down on her convictions and has coupled that with her own rage and need for vengeance. We also have Luther over here, who has never given up the strength of his convictions this entire time. He is still saying, hey, no, this is my brother. He's just sick. And Michael totally disagrees with him about being sick. And Luther does have a bit of a white savior complex in this way too, where he's not listening to Michael. Luther isn't quite totally understanding where Michael's coming from. Luther's like, I'm an epidemiologist, and this is just something that happened to you because of some gene that you had that got turned on by a long dormant prion disease that got reactivated due to global warming. So for him, this is very cut and dry. But for Michael's going, hey bro, this is who I am. This is a part of my actual DNA. This doesn't feel like I'm sick. The only thing that made me feel sick was when I was in the transition, and I'm trying to find an ethical way through this where people who are like me don't have to be ashamed or afraid of who they are. They can fully embrace it, but also minimize harming people who are non-combatants in a way. So he has qualms with harming children, that he's outright said that, don't harm children, but he himself has backed down from harming other vulnerable populations, like the lady who was blind at the bus station. So he's trying to figure this out for himself, his own identity, and a large portion of V-Wars is the question of identity. When this thing happens to you, when events and circumstances are beyond your control, and they change you, who are you now? Are you what the circumstances have done to you, or are you how you deal with them? Is it a combination of both? It's kind of a nature-nurture issue. But that gets more into Danny and her sister than anyone else. That's more of a Danny and Mila issue. But you see that it's different for Michael because he is very strong in his conviction that this is who he is as a person, and even if other people have a problem with it, that's not a him problem, that's a them problem. And he wants the people who are like him to be able to have pride in themselves. So you see a lot of parallels between where Michael stands with the Blood Nation and where we see the Black Lives Matter movement happening in the United States right now, where they're saying, hey, this is who I am, this is how I was born, I can't really change this, and even if I could, I'm not sure I would want to, which also has some parallels with the deaf community. And it's about embracing yourself for who and what you are. And I really love that about Michael. And then Luther just really believes in the good in other people. He doesn't necessarily, I don't think, even want to change Michael back to how he was before. He misses his brother and the relationship that he had before, but he just doesn't want people to get hurt, really. And I think that if Michael had just had superpowers and he wasn't killing people, then Luther wouldn't really have a problem with what's going on here either. It comes down to whether or not people are getting hurt. And Luther's first instinct seems to be do no harm. He's horrified when he kills people, when he pulls the trigger on that guy who was about to kill him and such, and is also horrified that he has killed his wife, Jess. So Luther is just really trying to believe in the good in humanity, but it's really messed him up so far in believing that he could go to the cops about his brother, who is a man of color and also a vampire at that point, and being like, hey, this man needs help. But again, as we discussed in previous episodes, there's not really a social system in place in the United States to handle that as an alternative to the police. It would have been much better to have a social worker or someone of that nature to go and help Michael at that time instead of going to the cops. But at the time, Luther did not understand or see or have access to an alternative. And people will often take the path of least resistance. It's the one they're most aware of, and that's the one that they're most capable of following. So this is also a social policy issue that we are seeing as we sift through the story that is V-Wars. And then we have Jimmy. So Jimmy has come into the story in kind of a weird way where he was already undercover and trying to figure out whether it's more important to maintain his cover or to effectively call the op right then, or to convince the guy he's supposed to kill to run away, but he's already been beaten to it. He lets Danica go. He is a phenomenal character. We know that he has his own children, but we don't hear him say much about it. He's very reticent. He's much more like Kaylee in many ways than he is like Luther or like Michael. He doesn't trust people like Michael, but also like Luther, he has a lot of heart. And I really love that all four of these characters, who are by and large my favorite characters in the show, now that Teresa's gone. Teresa was one of my other favorite characters, but at season 9 and on, these are my 4 favorite characters. It's really hard to just pick one or two. Oh, I forgot Mila. So Mila's one of my favorite characters as well. Honestly, they're just really great, nuanced characters for the most part in this show, and I love most of them. I don't love Dani. I love her as a character in that she's complex and she provides a great juxtaposition to understand many of the other characters, like Ava and Michael and Mila. But, like, if she was an individual person, she has a Backpfeifengesicht. She has a face in need of a punch. I'm sorry if I butchered that word, but it is one of my favorites when it comes to compound words. That vampire woman is just a terrible, terrible human being. And I'm not at all advocating for violence against women. I'm saying that as a vampire who preys on all of these people and is predatory and as awful as she was before, I am surprised we've not heard about more catfights she's been in, and that her catfights with Ava have not come to blows, considering the fact that they are both vampires with superhuman abilities who are also prone to increased aggression from what we can tell. Granted, we don't know precisely how Ava was before she was turned. We got to see that in Dani, but not in Ava. But we see that people in general in the show are pretty much the way that they were before, perhaps magnified just a little. But when we look at Dani versus Mila, or we look at characters like Michael, who have had time to turn and then, settle back into who they are as people, unlike poor Jess, who did not get that opportunity because she was killed first. We see, though, that these characters are typically how they were before. And that leads me to believe that Ava was already a little rough and tumble before. She seems kind of like a rough and tumble farm girl. And I think that she totally has been in several actual fistfights from how her character is coming across, and I'm surprised she has not popped Danny one in the process. We're gonna go on another break, and when we come back, we're gonna wrap up this episode and continuing to talk about how this conversation goes, as most of this episode is two men in a room talking. We'll be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how these four characters who show up to the cabin are really intertwined based on the strength of their convictions. That's what really brings them all together and what keeps them all together. Again, this episode is largely just two men in a room, and I really enjoy that about it. We haven't really gotten to see Luther and Mike's brotherhood that much lately. We got to establish it early on and through some other conversations that they've had, but this is really getting to see them together. And I know they get in a big argument in this episode, and they are very angry at each other, but that's kind of how best friends and family work sometimes. They say that you always hurt the ones that you love. And that's kind of how this goes. It's a lot easier for a lot of people to take things out on the people who are closest to them. Like you have a bad day at work and your boss is a jerk. Not my boss. My bosses are great. They've always been super great. But you get what I mean. Previous bosses I may have had in the past. And your bosses in general, perhaps. But if you have a bad day at the office and a coworker or your boss is just rude to you or cruel in whatever way or just not tactful, then you come home and you maybe have had a really bad day. You still don't feel like you've been able to decompress from your drive home or lack thereof in COVID-19, or for anyone else like me who has worked at home for the past several years. And you have a conversation with your partner, or you come in the door and they ask you for something before saying hey, or whatever little tiny thing it is just finally your straw, because you're back in your comfort zone, a place where you feel you can be yourself, including being angry. And so you snap at them. And it's not necessarily that person you're mad at. You're mad at a situation, not even necessarily one that concerns them. But people bounce back from that when the relationships are tight. Now that is definitely also not saying that it's okay to verbally abuse the people that you love. If you're doing things like that, then it's important to examine where you're actually getting upset and what you're upset about and what it is that's triggering it, and then also ways to prevent that from happening in the future. Finding things that are going to help you detox before you get home from work from all the anger. One of the things that one of my good friends used to do with me when we would work together is on the substantive drives back, she and I would listen to the entire discography of Coheed and Cambria at the time. This was over 10 years ago. And we would just sing it at the top of our lungs, too. And it really helped us to get all of the excess aggression and anxiety and just all of the crap that had gone wrong that day, that may have gone wrong, or things that just really long days, you know? Sometimes nothing bad really happens at work, but it's just been a very long day. And we were also working 11, 15-hour days routinely back then. So, you know, we're out in the sun. It's gonna happen. And we would go ahead and just sing it out in the car. And that helped us a lot. We're also very emotionally healthy with each other because we've been friends for so long. And so if one of us was being a B, the other one would just look up and go, you know, you're being a B right now. And you would go, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. You don't deserve that. I am just hot and or tired. And then the other one would like hand you a water and or a soda based on whether you needed sugar or just hydration. And, you know, also, you know, some wet wipes. We would keep baby wipes in the cooler to mostly for other people who would pass out in our tents a lot at festivals. But we would get one of those and cool off a little bit because it's like, hey, I'm getting irritated. This could be like a heat exhaustion type of symptom. I need to chill out. And quite literally as well. And that helped us quite a bit. But the thing is, we were that comfortable with each other that we could just go, hey, you're being real crappy right now. And the other one go, yeah, you're right. Because we weren't picking at each other about it. It wasn't judgmental. It was just, hey, you know, you're not going to lay your shadow. You're not going to lay your crap on me today. Like, I'm also not happy, but don't take this out on me. And it's like, you're right. You do not deserve me to take that out on you. And I will stop doing that now. I apologize. And it would be sincere, and we would go about our day. And we're still very close to this day, and we still fight and argue sometimes. And that's really where we see Luther and Mike here, is there has been some source of division between them. Whether that's, you know, you working with a friend and you can't agree on something within your business decisions, or you are living with a friend and it's turned out that you are the best of friends, but you, for whatever reason, cannot be roommates because of expectations or because of mismatches in personality that don't matter with friends or with someone that you're not living with, but do for folks you are living with. Or whether you just get in a fight about a misunderstanding. All of these types of things have happened in my life with my best friends. And sometimes we've gone 6 months or more without talking in the past. And whenever that's happened, we've found our own way back to each other, even if we don't talk about the actual issue that initially caused the rift. We don't necessarily need to go in depth about that because we know each other well enough to know why the other person was upset. And we've had enough space and time to go, yes, you were valid in that. And that doesn't invalidate my personal feelings, but I acknowledge your feelings on this matter, and we don't necessarily have to agree on it. But, you know, we can move forward from here. And I really love that about V-War's approach to brotherhood and this conversation between Luther and Mike, where at a certain point, Mike absolutely blows up on Luther and is telling him, you know, this is really hard for me. I am suddenly a leader of all of these people. This is so much pressure. There are lives at stake on both sides, contingent upon what I decide. And he likens it to feeling like he and Luther are trying to hold back the entire ocean. And it's so beautiful, the way that that line is written and the way that Adrian Holmes delivers it. It has so much emotion in it, and it is phrasing it as being a brotherhood. It's he and Luther. It's a we. He doesn't say it feels like I'm holding back the ocean. It feels like we are doing this. They are the missing links in this chain that's holding humanity together with Blood Nation. And it's under a lot of stress right now. And I do mean that in the mechanical and in the figurative sense. The literary sense. So it's a beautiful way for them to phrase this, and you can understand how gutting that has to be, to feel like if you mess up, the entire world may be really messed up because of you. It's one thing to look around at the world around you and go, man, these politicians and scientists and all these other decision makers are really messing everything up for the rest of us. They're messing things up for the rest of the world. But imagine looking at it and having to go, wow, I've really messed up an entire world. I have messed up everything. The world is terrible around me right now. I hate it. And it's all because of me. And I don't know how to get from point B back to point A. I can't unring this bell. And this is just how things are going. And it's all my fault. Granted, not everyone in a position of authority is going to feel any sort of remorse or guilt or wonder, even at the amount of destruction and violence that they may have caused, even inadvertently. But in the case of Michael Fain, Michael does care, and this is where we see a lot of his empathy shine through. We've seen him question other people's motives and actions previously, and him start setting these boundaries. But Michael, with Luther, is able to be entirely who he is. Michael's also been feeling weak lately, and no one else has really said anything to him about it, but Luther does call him out on it, and he's like, look, I know you, and other people might not catch that, but what is going on? Why are you being, looking like you're kind of peaked and like you're going to fall over right now? And he just gets really mad at him about it, and he's like, I'm fine, because he's reached his threshold of this negotiation with Luther and still processing his feelings about how things have been and his estrangement, his effective estrangement from his brother. It's a lot for Michael, and I can see how that would really take up a lot of emotional bandwidth. I don't blame him for being upset, but I'm also glad that Luther isn't scared of him, and he tells him that, and he's like, look, I'm not scared of you. You are still my brother, and you can get angry at me. You can tell they've likely had super big arguments over the years, been very angry at each other, but that also just serves to strengthen bonds. Now, I don't mean that that's always a good thing, because that also happens a lot in toxic relationships. So when I say that fighting strengthens bonds, it is very similar neurochemically in what it ends up doing to your bond as having a lot of sex and releasing a lot of oxytocin does. Just because biology is a bee sometimes. It is a bummer. So that's how your brain works, and it can reinforce those bonds that you have with another person. So if you know someone who's toxic, like Harley and the Joker, and they're always fighting and everything, but they're still together, and you're like, why? Well, it can just really chemically make you more bonded. It makes you feel a closer bond to that person. But if you're not fighting all the time, you're just having natural disagreements that occur sometimes in any relationship between people. Sometimes it's gonna end up a little heated, and sometimes it's gonna take you a little bit to work through your feelings about it and to reconcile with your friend. But it's the act of reconciliation, really, that is helping promote that bond, because you're able to still come back and come to terms. You still feel enough of a pull towards that person to turn back towards them after you have turned away, or after they've turned away from you. You're willing to take that first step. And so I think that as someone who has been estranged from some of my best friends in the past for months at a time, from just having very strong disagreements and then having come back from that, I really enjoyed this portrayal of these two characters. The people in my life who are like brothers or sisters to me, I haven't fought that hard with all of them, but some of them I have. And then we get back together after being apart for a long time, and it's just like nothing happened. We still maintain our stances on how we personally feel about things, but we've decided that that's not necessarily a breaking point for our friendship, and that we can perhaps find a compromise as Luther and Michael try to do in this episode. Mike is eventually sitting down with Luther and discussing how these political games work and trying to phrase everything specifically. And Mike says, the devil's in the details. And that is very true, because we also see Nikos going to turn himself into a vampire in the end of this episode, or towards the end of this episode. And he really is the devil in these details. He's orchestrating a lot of this scientifically, and he's involved in the political game. Although he does ask the senator calling the shots to pick a different scapegoat. And so we do have a devil in the details. We also end up seeing Jimmy getting shot while clearing the perimeter. And it's just a redneck, survivalist type guy who's hanging out in the woods nearby and thinks that Jimmy is a blood and shoots him in the leg. And they think Jimmy might not make it until they have Kaylee take him to the hospital, because the other two have been on the news and they can't have their faces out there. Kaylee's face has also been on the news when she did the expose of Michael, but it's not going to be as recognizable as the other two. So Kaylee gets charged with driving Jimmy to the hospital, and she's chattering to him the entire time, which is interesting because Kaylee keeps everything so close to her vest. But Jimmy's bleeding out next to her. He might not make it. She's recently lost Jurgen, and Jimmy, I think, is one of the characters who is most like Kaylee herself. I think they both feel deeply, but also keep everyone out. And so they have their different reasons for that. I think Jimmy's is more to protect other people, and Kaylee's is mostly to protect herself. But she's just chattering away at him, and she's like, are you okay? What are you doing? What are you saying? And he's like, I'm just praying that the creator takes me now. It's sooner rather than later, because I am tired of hearing you talk. And it's pretty funny. We are lucky in that Jimmy turns out to be okay, but Kaylee at first thinks that he's dead, and she cries a little bit. And it's weird that she's crying in this dream state for Jimmy, but it's probably kind of a manifestation of her processing her feelings with Jurgen. She's been angry and everything, but she's finally crying. And Jimmy essentially tells her, good, that means that she's healing. And it's really important to have those cleansing tears sometimes. It's fine to be angry for a while, but anger largely keeps that sadness at bay. Anger is often a mechanism we use to feel less so that we don't hurt so much. But if you don't feel through it, then a lot of times it's difficult to make that problem ever go away. That's something that I have been working on learning myself while I've been home in North Carolina recently, and my best friend's helping me with it. I'm still working on it, but it was also very interesting to see that playing out in V-Wars 2. This episode was really interesting to me. I know a lot of folks were like, this is just two men in a room together, and that's why I mentioned it a couple times, because I've seen some complaints about it. But I think that their dynamic is very strong. It helped underline their past and friendship by them, Michael blowing up on Luther, and then Luther still showing concern for him and just being not really fazed by it. And how Luther reports that to the senator. And also how they just look at each other after Jimmy is loaded into the car and is taken to the ER by Kaylee. That, this reminds them of a time they were in another country and had to help a guy get out of wherever they were, where he'd been injured. And Michael's like, yeah, that guy didn't make it. And they were just like, because they really weren't sure that Jimmy was gonna make it. But it also underlines that they've done this kind of thing before. And in that way, it sounds like maybe Luther also has an MD, and that perhaps he and Mike had worked together with Doctors Without Borders as a kind of thing. So that would make sense in perhaps how they met, or even maybe they joined together. Who knows? But now I'm thinking perhaps Luther is an MD who specialized in epidemiology, maybe has a dual MD and a PhD. I'm not sure, you guys. It's still a mystery about what kind of doctor Luther is in my book. But maybe that's just the one secret he keeps. He wears most of everything else on his sleeve, Dr. Swan. But maybe that part's the secret. We'll see. Maybe I just need to read the comic to get it listed out. For now, though, we are done for the day. We will pick up with Amelie and Des and Senator Giroux in the next episode, when we also talk about Season 1, Episode 10 of V-Wars. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.